It's such a pleasure to have so much interaction in the comments. Brian Taylor brought up a brilliant polymath who merits a lot of attention, so let's look at him. Immanuel Velikovsky. He was born in Belarus. In 1895, he learned several languages and studied medicine at Montpellier in France, Edinburgh in Scotland, and Moscow in Russia. He then went to Berlin, where he edited and published 2 collections of scientific papers translated into Hebrew. Albert Einstein helped with the volume on maths and physics papers. They maintained a lasting friendship. Velikovsky then went to the British Mandate of Palestine and practiced medicine as a general practitioner and a psychiatrist. He was inspired by Freud's Moses and monotheism to search for connections between the Bible and ancient Egyptian papyruses. In 1939, he went to New York, where there were excellent libraries. He was working on a book about these connections. Soon after he arrived, the Second World War broke out. He became a permanent resident and spent much of his time at Columbia, Princeton, and other university libraries. His studies led to broadening the scope of his research into catastrophic events, particularly those in Genesis and Exodus, to civilizations across the world. His researches led to a book, Worlds in Collision, published in 1950, which caused a stir the likes of which have rarely been seen. Velikovsky took Freud's claim that stories handed down for generations were based on real events, but they are now called myths because people don't like to relive the disasters of the past. He looked at the ancient stories of civilizations from Scandinavia to Greece and Rome, from the American Aboriginal tribes to the Incas, Aztecs, and the Mayan people, from India to China, and from Egypt to Babylon and Persia. He concluded that within these stories from all over the world, certain themes recur so frequently that they point to real history. These themes include a worldwide flood and drastic changes in planetary orbits, particularly of Venus and Mars, leading to major influences on the Earth. Not surprisingly, the scientific establishment was furious. Harlow Shapley, for example, used his scientific clout to have the editor which allowed publication of the book fired. And he had the chairman of the astronomy department and director of the Hayden Planetarium fired from both posts for taking Velikovsky seriously. Shapley, like many of the other fanatical opponents, admitted he had never read the book. But he realized that if what Velikovsky was saying was even partially true, then Lyell's uniformity principle, which is as central to astronomy as it is to geology, would be totally discredited. Much of astronomy would fall apart, along with much of geology and the Enlightenment's atheist secular worldview. So, not surprisingly, that is still the stance of the scientific establishment. If you ask an AI bot about Velikovsky, it will assure you he was a crank and scientists reject what he said. But as usual, if you ask more probing questions, the bot will soften up a bit and admit, Velikovsky employed comparative mythology to link mythological and historical accounts from different cultures, suggesting they describe the same events. But it will then tell you, it is important to note that Velikovsky's use of these sources is widely considered pseudo-scientific by modern academics. Mainstream historians, archaeologists and astronomers have rejected his interpretations for several reasons, one of which is ignoring scientific consensus. Velikovsky disregarded well-established astronomical and geological principles in favour of his catastrophic models. And of course, the most unacceptable crime was rejecting the uniformity principle. The scientific establishment has always been careful to exclude any of Velikovsky's work from their journals. Only criticism is allowed. So if you want to hear the other side, you will have to go to the original sources and see what open-minded scientists wrote. Fortunately, there was a Canadian philosophical publication, Pensée, which is French for thought, concept, or idea, which was connected with a student movement called the Student Academic Freedom Forum at the University of Oregon, which published a series of papers by scientists for and against Velikovsky, and gave him the opportunity to defend his ideas against criticism. No establishment publication ever gave him the chance to respond to articles they published criticising him. A selection of those papers were published as a little book, Immanuel Velikovsky Reconsidered, which is on Google Internet Archive and can be freely accessed. I'd like to share a few items from some of those papers. Firstly, a comment from the introduction. It is fair to say that the academic community as a whole has not yet accorded Velikovsky the hearing he deserves. The efforts of certain spokesmen to discredit this heretic, coupled with de facto censorship by others, constitutes a depressing chapter in the history of science. It then introduces a paper by Dr. L. E. Rose, Professor of Philosophy at the State University of New York. The censorship of Velikovsky's interdisciplinary synthesis. Lynn E. Rose analyses arguments raised against Velikovsky by his critics. He disregards boundaries that have traditionally set various fields of inquiry apart, and invades sciences for which he carries no credential. He dares to suggest the presence of physical forces not taken into account in conventional celestial mechanics, and he challenges uniformitarian notions that deny the solar system a natural history. Rose stresses the fallacies in such arguments and suggests that Velikovsky's historical reconstructions do not require us to abandon anything science has truly learned, as distinguished from things assumed and presumed. And these points resonate with some of our earlier episodes. Faraday had no qualifications at all, he taught himself, which is precisely what Velikovsky did when dealing with non-medical matters. As Richard Milton pointed out in episode 80, few, if any, breakthroughs in science have come from insiders for quite a long time. They've come from heretics like Eric Laithwaite. And Velikovsky's claim that electromagnetic effects should be taken into account have been confirmed. He pointed to the Van Allen belt, and Van Allen went ahead and found it. The critics vilified Velikovsky's proposal that Venus and Mars had suffered major changes in their orbits. Shapley and everybody around him had claimed that their orbits had been calculated backwards and forward for vast ages of time, and who was Velikovsky to claim these calculations were wrong? Velikovsky was confident of what he was saying because he'd examined the ancient Babylonian tablets recording observations of Venus. Professor Rose, who took Velikovsky seriously and tried hard to reconcile these observations to current theory, pointed out, when you examine the content of those tablets, widely referred to as the Venus tablets of Amizaduga, they turn out to support Velikovsky and not his critics. There is no way the tablets can be reconciled with the present motions of Venus except by denying, in one way or another, that the Babylonians saw what they say they saw. In another paper, we read, Velikovsky's original work was ridiculed, ignored, and then, as with all great work, it was copied. And its conclusions were often arrived at independently by other investigators without due credit being given to Velikovsky. Noted scientists have recently postulated interplanetary changes and collisions of the Earth with external bodies, and the possibility of the very events resulting from these collisions that Velikovsky described in 1950. One of the most obvious cases of this concerns Venus. Before Velikovsky's worlds in collision, it was widely thought that the temperature of Venus was about 100 degrees Celsius. Practically all calculations agreed with that. Velikovsky predicted that because of recent interactions with Mars and Earth, Venus would be very hot. He didn't predict how hot. When Venus probes found that its temperature was over 700 degrees C, the astronomers of the world scrambled for an explanation. There's a dense atmosphere of carbon dioxide. CO2 is known to have a small greenhouse effect. This was known long before the probe got there. It could perhaps be stretched to account for a few degrees more than they'd calculated. But they knew that water vapour was the only greenhouse gas which could give anything close to the greenhouse effect they needed. But they couldn't find the water vapour. So Carl Sagan loudly claimed it must be due to the clouds of sulfuric acid in the lower atmosphere. And that is still a popular story, even though it's been soundly disproved. On balance, Velikovsky's history of Venus seems much more concordant with the known facts about the heat of Venus than any rival explanation that has yet been put forward. What his view lacks in quantitative terms, it more than makes up by leaving no single item of observable evidence to be explained away by some entirely unrelated hypothesis. We have gone into this matter of the heat of Venus in considerable detail here because it illustrates not only the apparent pertinence of Velikovsky's thesis to a phenomenon he predicted long before it was discovered, but also the extremes to which his opponents still go to deny him recognition for his achievements. The fact that uniformitarians can think and speak of these as inner contradictions is only symptomatic of how deeply ingrained the astronomer's dogma is. It just never occurs to its victims that they are making any assumptions at all. As far as they're concerned, if the historical record conflicts with the modern retro calculations, there must be some defect in the historical record, and it is perfectly all right to refer to this defect as an inner contradiction. And this is not just an isolated case. We saw in episode 31 that when George Dodwell pointed out that observations of the Earth's axis tilt from ancient civilizations all over the world completely disagree with the accepted Newcomb's formula, they simply claimed the ancient observations must have been inaccurate. And when those ancient observations pointed to a huge, earth-shattering catastrophic event 4,500 years ago, they took great pains to prevent his work from ever being published. By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. Our God is in the heavens. He hath done whatsoever he hath pleased. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Thank you for joining me for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe and press the bell so that you'll be notified as I release new movies. If you'd like to support this project, you're welcome to do so through Patreon. Find a link on my channel banner and in the description below.